All of us have had at least some experiences where things haven't gone our way, and in certain cases, when it's really tough, we tend to think more negatively than we usually do. So our mind perspective shifts entirely. We might feel more emotional, more upset, more frustrated, and when we're feeling these ways, we tend to be more impressionable. We tend to believe a lot more of what we think. You may be in a scenario where it's so dark that you wonder even if life has any meaning at all. Now, I know that speaking of this from a bird's eye view as I am now is kind of makes it look silly to think about this. Not that it's not true or could be true or whatever, it's just that it doesn't seem like there's a necessity to even think that way at all. But sometimes in life, things go haywire and you spiral downwards, and maybe you'll stumble upon this belief as a potential reality. So that's cool and all, we can believe certain things. Everyone has a set of beliefs that they live their life by. But what I'm suggesting is that the belief that life has no meaning might be harmful for a number of reasons. The first one is that if you actually believe this, you might just tend to fall into depression, and I don't think bouts of depression are inherently a bad thing. You can learn a lot while in a period of depression, especially if you question that and try and figure it out. Some of the biggest growth in my life has occurred in difficult times, of course, I think with everyone. But if you hold on to that belief and you don't question it, then you're just stuck in depression, and who knows what will happen. And it's just not a high quality of life experience to be having. The other end of the question, if you believe it, is maybe you go entirely to the nihilistic side where life has no meaning, so that means there's no morals needed, no social constructs, no nothing. I can do whatever I want, I can rob a bank, I can kill someone. You can see how this goes haywire quickly, and that's quite a dangerous mindset to have if we're going to be living together amongst ourselves as humans. So I'm going to offer the alternative. If you are thinking the question, does life have any meaning, then think further. Don't just stop there, even if you're feeling frustrated or upset. Actually dig into that question and break it apart into pieces, and that's what we're going to do in the next parts of this video. So the first thing we have to do when considering this question, basically, does the world have any meaning? Does it have no meaning? Does life have no meaning? We have to consider what we mean by the world or by life. Most of the time when people ask this question, the assumption is that the world is like a singular entity. It's like an entity separate from ourselves. It's something that kind of plays behind the scenes and determines our fate, the fate of everything else, and there's like a set path. And basically when we ask, is there no meaning, is there no, what we're asking is, have I not been assigned any meaning by this outer entity? However, even if you believe in a separate entity from yourself, this is not what the world is. If you look at it from a larger picture, the world is literally everything in existence, not only all-inclusive, but infinitely expanding. And if something includes everything and is infinitely expanding, there is no center to it. If there was a center to it, that would imply that it's a distinct thing separate from those other parts. But what the world actually is the entirety. It's the whole thing, including any central parts. So I'm not saying not to believe or to believe in any other entity, whether you consider that God or spirit, or doesn't really matter, nature. What I'm saying is that so long as there is a separate entity, there's also everything that's not the entity. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the whole thing, the whole world, including everything and everything that it is becoming. There is no center to that. There is no distinction. It's everything. Okay, so that's one part of the question. We clarified what the world means, what life means, and we understand that it's not this thing that determines anything about you. So that might make you think, okay, well, if there isn't anything to determine my purpose, that means there is no purpose. That might make you think that if there isn't a thing that determines my meaning, then that means there is no meaning, which means that the question is true. But before we get into that, let's also define what we mean by meaning, right? There's two parts to this question. By meaning, when we ask this question, what we're talking about basically is purpose. If we just come into the question assuming what the world is, we'll think that there's this one thing that gives us a purpose to fulfill, that we're fated to do in this world. But just by defining what the world is, we understand that's not really accurate. So again, what does that mean in regards to having meaning, having purpose? Does that mean there isn't any? Well, let me provide an example and then we'll continue from there. So you have, let's say, a hammer, right? A hammer, what is it used for? What is its purpose, in other words? The purpose of a hammer is to help build, right? It's to hammer in nails into whatever you need to hammer a nail into so that it helps construct something. But actually, if you think about it, a hammer is also used to destroy. You can smash things with it. You can destroy. I mean, it's just, a hammer could be a weapon. You have these two different purposes, right? You have building and destroying. So which one is it? Oh wait, there's another one. You can use the back part of a hammer as a plier to pry things open. So now there's three. What's the point? Like 3 purposes? So if you consider, each purpose depends on the need. The purpose is relative to a desired outcome, which again aligns with this thing of there being no central entity, right? Yes, the world has many entities. Every one of us is a distinct entity, different animals, different, like anything that's a different thing in this world is a separate, you can call it entity. If it's living or not living, doesn't really matter. You can relate purpose to anything, it just depends on the perspective, which means also that there's as many purposes as there are perspectives. In other words, there's pretty much infinite amount of purpose, even for yourself, depending on what is looking at you. Like for an ant, you are basically, your purpose is to scare them and make them almost lose their life if you step on them. For an ant, you're basically a warning sign. But if you have a dog, then for your dog, your purpose, obviously many things, but maybe it's to give him dinner that night. You can see how purpose varies on the perspective of what is giving you the purpose. So you might think, okay, hammers, ants, dogs, none of these are human, so why does any of this apply to me? Well, okay, I'll give you a more human example. Let's say an example of sports. What is the purpose of sports, assuming you like sports? Well, for you as a viewer, the purpose of sports is, in most cases, it's going to be entertainment. It's going to be something that you watch to enjoy, to look forward to doing on your own free time. But for an athlete, what is the purpose of that sport? For most athletes, it's a livelihood. It's not necessarily to give you entertainment. I guess there are some athletes who their only purpose is to give you entertainment, but that's unlikely. Most athletes, their purpose is to play the sport because they earn from it. They make a living from it. Obviously, I'm talking about professional athletics. It changes depending on the type of athletics. Again, purpose depends on the perspective. Even if you do believe in a separate entity like a higher power, the purpose that's given to you is dependent. So on the relative perspective, again, the purpose given to you by that higher power, if you believe in that, is still relative to that higher power. Your purpose to your coworkers is going to be different. Your purpose to your pets is going to be different. Your purpose to the garden that you take care of is going to be different. Even if there's a higher power, purpose is not ultimate. Purpose is relative. So again, if I look at things, or if we look at things in an ultimate perspective, all inclusive of all perspectives entirely, so does that mean that we're combining all the perspectives into one, or that there is no purpose? Again, that's kind of a misconstrued viewpoint. It's not one or the other. It's that ultimately there's no need for purpose. If everything is included in the ultimate reality, which it is, and that's what we mean by the world, it's not that there is no purpose, but literally that purpose as a concept doesn't exist. It only exists because we have a perspective to take on to give purpose. So ultimately, it's not that the purpose is no purpose, it's that literally purpose is an illusion. It's made up depending on what it's needed for. Literally, what purpose does purpose serve? That's a relative viewpoint. It depends on the perspective. Okay, interesting, right? We've kind of broken things into parts. We've defined what the world is and what purpose is, and we've basically clarified that ultimately purpose does not exist, but relatively it It depends on the perspective taken. But when you're asking the question, does the world have any meaning? You're looking for something specific, so you're not really satisfied by just what I've said, most likely. When you're asking the question, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of the world? What kind of meaning is there? What you're really asking is your purpose relative to the rest of the world. So not your purpose inclusive of everything that exists, but your purpose relative to everything else that is happening. And the key to this is basically your inclinations, what you gravitate towards. You might understand that there's certain things in life that you are more attracted to. Different lines of work, different locations, different people. You have like a natural tendency to gravitate towards those things. And at least in my view, you can see your purpose relative to the rest of the world to kind of tug on those strings and follow them and see where they lead. This is the case because this is what your natural expression is, following those inclinations of who you uniquely are as an individual, as a person, as a human. So you might be unhappy because you're not following your inclinations, you're following what society tells you to do, what your family tells you to do. This isn't what you actually want to do deep down, and that might lead you to the question, is there any meaning in life? But if you gently start to notice your personal desires, I'm not talking about like your desires for pleasure, I'm talking about your desires for fulfillment. If you follow that, that's your expression. That's like who you are as a person. That's basically what purpose is. If you do believe in that separate entity, again, it's basically that entity moving through you, expressing through you. In that way, a separate entity it's involved in a certain way, but just remember that separate entity is not ultimate. In any case, if you want a little bit of a mind fuck, you do not control the sources of where your inclinations come from. So ultimately speaking, you actually don't control your purpose at all. You don't control your inclinations. You don't control what you are attracted towards, what you gravitate towards naturally. So in that viewpoint, you don't actually have control over your purpose. But putting that aside, because that's just true for everything and everyone, you do have control over following that inclination and deciding to move towards it. That's basically what purpose is, really. At least on an existential level, purpose relative to the rest of the world. Like I said before, there's as many purposes as there are perspectives, but this is the perspective in regards to yourself and everything else. So just to wrap things up, ultimately, we've determined that because there's no central location of an ultimate universe to determine perspective, there's no such thing as purpose because you need a perspective to determine a purpose. Relatively speaking, it depends entirely on the perspective. So your perspective towards sports is different than the athlete's perspective towards sports. An ant's perspective of you is different than a dog's perspective of you. For all those different perspectives, the purpose is different. So in your case of living life, it's not like you have a one singular purpose. Purpose evolves over time. It depends on what matters most to you. And it depends on how your expression and inclinations change over time. So purpose can change, and it does. Anyways, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. If you liked and this helped you out, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It really helps, especially in the early parts of my channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.